At the beginning of our study of Roman civilization, it will be helpful to say a few words about the foundation of the city and thus the civilization of Rome, and in particular, the role of myth and legend in the written history of the Roman state. The early Rome of legend, from the ancient Romans' point of view, was connected deeply to the mythical background of the Mediterranean world. In particular, the Romans identified the Trojan hero Aeneas, an escapee from Troy at the time of the Trojan War, as their original founder figure. Aeneas, escaping from Troy along with his father Anchises and son Iulus, brought with him the household gods of his people, the so-called Penates, and through an epic journey best described by the Latin poet Virgil in his poem The Aeneid, traveled on a rather circuitous route to end up in Italy, whereby men and kings descended from Aeneas would produce the mythical twins Romulus and Remus, born of a mortal woman, Rhea Silvia, a priestess of the goddess Vesta, and the god Mars. Rhea Silvia violated her oath as a priestess of Vesta, and thus Romulus and Remus were condemned to die. They magically survived with the help of a friendly she-wolf and later a human shepherd who rescued them from the wild. They grew to be young men who wanted to do right, punish wrongdoers, and eventually set out to establish their own city, their own kingdom. Conflict between them arose. Romulus killed his brother Remus and became Rome's first king, Rex being the Latin word for king. His kingship and his foundation of Rome was sanctioned by signs from the gods that Romulus had observed through the science of augury, the observation of the flight of birds in the sky, and the Palatine and Capitoline hills became the nucleus of the Rome of Romulus. Whether Romulus and the mythical stories of the she-wolf are historical fact is a matter of debate among scholars still, but traditionally the Romans believe that Romulus founded the city in the year 753 BC. And we do see on the archaeological side of things that the archaeological record shows us that in the early part of the first millennium BC, there is evidence for Iron Age peoples living on the hilltops of what would become Rome, including on the Palatine Hill. The traditional chronology for the early part of Rome's history extends this so-called regal period of kings, from 753 down to about 509 BC, in which year the kings were expelled from Rome, and Rome transitioned to a republican form of government with elected officers. And this republican period continued down until the Battle of Actium in the year 31 BC. The best evidence for early Rome from the archaeological record comes in the form of burials, where we see clusters of pre-urban burials, usually on the slopes or at the foots of the hills in the lower Tiber Valley, because generally adult dead were buried outside of the settlement, not inside of the settlement. So the early Iron Age scene here probably saw small independent villages clustered on hilltops. Set within the environs of central Italy, Rome's nearest Etruscan neighbor, the Etruscans being a complex Iron Age civilization located to the north in what's now the area known as Tuscany. Rome's nearest Etruscan neighbor was the city of Veii. And we see a close connection between the emergence of Rome and an earlier culture of the Bronze Age, the so-called Apennine culture. The Romans grow up in this territory of Latium, now Lazio, in Italy, the region of Latin speakers. The Tiber River, on which Rome is located, is a major landscape feature for transportation and commerce. And the salt pans, Salinae, areas where salt naturally collects at the mouth of the river Tiber, represented a major resource, a valuable resource at that that the Romans controlled. The burial custom in this early period is for the most part cremation, where individuals are cremated. Their cremated remains are placed into ceramic containers, sometimes with grave goods, grave offerings, and then that container is buried, usually capped with a piece of pottery or a stone. In some cases, some high-ranking members of these Iron Age communities have a cremation urn that is shaped like a hut. Thus, we call them hut urns. These are the minority case, but they represent likely important people in those early communities. The hut urns, in turn, resemble the actual huts. The Iron Age huts for which we have evidence on the Palatine Hill might have looked something like this. A superstructure with an A-frame roof of poles lashed together, the roof covered with thatch, and the walls of the hut formed with wattle and daub, a woven framework of branches over which mud plaster was applied. Mostly the evidence for these huts comes in the form of their foundations, their footprints and post holes. But we can see a small cluster of these villages on the Palatine in the early Iron Age. At the foot of the Palatine, the so-called Forum Necropolis, we have a series of burials with both inhumation and cremation burials. Again, the burials tend to lie outside of the settlement. This valley of the Forum, located between the Capitoline and Palatine Hills, came to be important when the Iron Age villages that were once independent started to cooperate and become eventually the political unit that we identify as Rome. The Forum Valley was originally prone to being quite marshy due to seasonal flooding, and during the later 7th and 6th centuries BC, one of Rome's first identifiable public works project is the filling of the valley, dumping artificial landfill into the valley in order to raise the surface and thus make the space more usable, dry it out, so to speak. And you can see the cross-section here of the layers, over 20 strata, 20 layers of deliberate fill, an enormous labor-intensive project to deposit all of this material. And the Forum would emerge as a key public area for political, commercial, and sacred business. In addition to raising the ground surface, the Romans worked to channelize existing water, creating the Great Sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, so that this small stream would flow underground eventually and not get the Forum wet. And you can see here the course of the cloaca running through the Forum. Ironically, the shrine of the Venus of Cloacina, Venus of the Sewer, commemorated this public works project and the creation of the cloaca. And you can see the footprint of the sewer shrine, reconstruction, and the appearance of that shrine on an ancient coin. So the Forum, you can see here the drawing of the Forum in a later period, emerges as this place where there's lots of key buildings for politics, for commerce, and for ritual. One of the key early buildings that survives and lives throughout the history of the city is the so-called Regia, an unusual small building that is a sort of sacred house, a ceremonial house for Rome's king. Too small of a house for actual day-to-day dwelling, but a sort of ritual headquarters for the king, who was also the chief priest of the state. And we see this very famous terracotta decoration from the Regia that shows us a difficult-to-explain frieze of large felines and a minotaur, a bull-headed man in procession. This pottery fragment from the Regia records on it in an inscription the Latin word rex, meaning king. So these early kings play a key role not just in politics, but also in religion. Across the street from the Regia is the Temple of Vesta. The hearth fire, eternal hearth fire of the Roman state was maintained there by priestesses who were chosen to serve the cult and serve the state, and lived on site in the area just behind the temple itself. On the Capitoline Hill in the 6th century BC emerged Rome's great temple, the most important temple of the state, the so-called Capitolium. The Capitoline additionally was the citadel, the arx, the safe place to which the Romans could retreat in times of danger. This temple on the Capitolium, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter best and greatest, is dedicated by the late 6th century BC. It is the most important temple of the Roman state and represents the focus of Rome's state religion, of which Jupiter was the chief god. You can see a reconstruction of how the temple might have looked here. A massive temple, another massive public works undertaking. And the Romans built this temple in a style that follows the architectural patterns of their neighbors, the Etruscans. The very high podium, a high platform, a frontal orientation, and not one but 3 cult rooms for a triad of divinities, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, worshipped all together here in the same structure. The foundations of the temple remain today. Nothing of the superstructure remains, but the temple is a massive undertaking and an important one for the duration of Roman history. It dominates the landscape, for sure. And this is supposedly, in the historical record, an act of the kings. The kings facilitate this construction. And scholars debate whether to give much credence to the stories of Romulus and the dates of foundation and the legendary nature of some of these early events, and continue to debate and argue quite violently about that topic in some cases. A find in the late 1980s, 1988, threw more fuel on the fire when a mid-8th century BC wall at the foot of the Palatine, the hill on which Romulus supposedly founded the city, was discovered. And so this is to say that we continue to debate and discuss, from our point of view, the role and the importance of early legend in the foundation of the state. But we should note that for the ancient Romans themselves, these legends and origin stories were incredibly important, incredibly vital to their identity as they projected themselves and their state within the broader Mediterranean world.